Picking back up with Chapter 4 of Zero Tolerance, titled Alt-Right, Hipster Conservatism? ? This chapter is only about 5.5 pages, so really shouldn't take too long. And when the alt-right first began to gain more traction, it created a distinction between itself and the mainstream American right wing of the conservative Republican Party, hence the name alternative right, as in an alternative to Republican conservatism, which has been discredited for cucking on its principles and giving into liberal left-wing demands and narratives. Now, all these left-wing, right-wing, they're in tweezers here, as they've said before in earlier chapters. Or I guess, as Alexander said in earlier chapters, the political spectrum itself is bullshit. And if you want to learn more about that, you can listen to the earlier recordings. Republican conservatism, which has been discredited for cucking on its principles and giving into liberal left-wing demands and narratives, thus earning itself the denigrating title of cuckservatism. Cuckservatism, he says. Cuckservatism. That's a Chan term, if I've ever heard one. I can't be certain. I haven't been on those anonymous image boards for a couple of years now, but I'm pretty sure that's where that cuck term originated. Possibly. Don't quote me on that, but I remember seeing it quite often on places like 8chan and whatnot. This term was used to further draw the line of distinction between the alt-right and the mainstream American right wing. There had later been talk of substituting mainstream conservatism and the Republican Party, which supported with supporting memes of "Look at me, I'm the GOP now." If we take this alone into consideration, then we do indeed get an image of the alt-right as a kind of hipster conservatism or a conservatism for millennials, a new and hip brand that revitalized old conservative values for a younger generation, making it fun. In the overview of the last possibility of what the alt-right might be, racist liberals, in parentheses, we will look at what it actually is, as there is more to it than just this. However, when we take only the highlights above into consideration as well as their implications, we still get a legitimate insight into certain events which we will address later. The irony here is, of course, that the inception of the alt-right apparently owes itself to what our allies criticize ourselves for repeatedly, namely punching right. The whole reason the alt-right exists is because that it punched the GOP for either cucking/betraying conservative values or apparently for not being right-wing enough. However, the bigger issue at hand is that American conservatism has never been right-wing by European standards. Again, we must deal with the relative nature of this right/left dichotomy. Moreover, conservatism itself is a relative concept with no fundamental values to its name, something we explored in quite some detail in another previous article, con/conservative reactionary revolutionary. Con/conservative reactionary revolutionary. One can certainly ascribe more definitive traits to a given form of conservatism by giving it a clarifying denomination such as American conservatism as per our primary discussion venue, and yet when you do that, you are still left with something that takes its origin in what was called left-wing in Europe, namely in the model of classical liberalism. Thus, American conservatism is nothing more than the defense of classical liberalism on which the United States of America had been originally founded, with Enlightenment and rationalism values at its core, including the germ of that poisonous idea of equality, whatever hopes the United States had to escape those values in favor of an organic national identity instead of a fake paper identity issued by the state and reinforced by one's adherence to its liberal values, were repeatedly and thoroughly smashed by our enemies, including the Jews. This was elaborated on in some detail by Francis Parker Yockey. Quote, America began its independent political existence as a creature of rationalism. Its politicians agreed to the proposition externally that all men are created equal, and even said this was self-evident. To call it self-evident and thus dispense with proof was easier and perhaps wiser than to prove it. Proof would have spoiled with it what is actually a tenet of a faith and thus above reason. The religion of rationalism God dang it. The religion of rationalism dominated America in a way that it was never able to dominate Europe. Europe always had resistance against rationalism. Based on tradition until the middle of the 19th century, and after that based on anticipation of the coming anti-rationalist spirit of the 20th century, as exemplified in Carlyle and Nietzsche. But America did not possess the first because it had no tradition, and had not the second because cultural impulses and culture-forwarding phenomena came from the mother soil and are thence radiated outward, as the rationalistic religion of America came from England through France. America, as the country most completely disintegrated by rationalism, exhibited the least understanding of the nature of the Jew, while there were always some people in Europe, for instance Carlyle, even during the 19th century, who realized the total and not merely political alienness of the Jew. But in America, with its complete lack of tradition, there were no Carlyles, no de Lagardes. Thus, America decided in the middle of the 19th century that a Chinaman born in the United States thereby acquired exactly the same American citizenship as the white native population of European derivation. Characteristically, the decision was not made in a responsible fashion, but as the result of a lawsuit. This was in pursuance of an American custom of deciding political questions in a pseudo-legal form. Obviously, a regime which did not differentiate between Chinese and Native American would oppose no political barrier to the Jew, and so, by 1928, the French writer on historical and world political topics, André Siegfried, could say that New York City had a Semitic countenance. By the middle of the 20th century, this development had gone further, and New York City, the largest city in America, perhaps in the world, was almost half Jewish in population. Francis Parker Yockey, Imperium. As such, the entirety of the mainstream American right wing is by definition no ally of ours, as it is rooted in everything that we vehemently oppose and see to be at fault in the world. In fact, the entirety of the American state exists as a direct enemy to our values and goals. The only valid fascist/National Socialist action in America is that of the absolutely leveling of the existing state culture, its values. In short, the total destruction of Americanism, tweezers, Americanism as such. Only then can something organic and thus fascist/National Socialist be grown in its place. Quote, "Here the sickness has been coming along, unabated, for at least 3 generations, and probably more. It's their own baby and they love it. They wouldn't be parted from it. It's part of Americanism. This sickness is homegrown and it is from the inside out." James Mason, Siege 3.9. This concept has been promoted as American futurism. The entirety of James Mason's Siege deals with the very goal of leveling the American system, to which he referred as the, quote, beast system, a thing more loathsome and evil than any which appears in the Bible, end quote. Quote, "The enemy today is the United States government itself, and it is, by every standard of measure, the most evil thing that has ever existed on earth. This, once it has sunk home, should be a good enough indicator of the sort of struggle we have ahead of us." James Mason Siege 2.2. This should only further illustrate how little relative terms of right/left wing mean, and exactly why we will never accept calls of allegiance on that premise. We judge things based on the values they promote. If those values are not our own, then we are enemies. If we were to be convinced that the United States were at one point founded on something real and worth preserving, we would still call for an all-out attack on its institutions, for victory of the race will not be achieved in defense of some dying and decrepit structure, but only through life-affirming attack and conquest. Quote, "The very word and idea of conservatism guarantees that the victims of this delusion will merely try to conserve what is already gone, such as the Constitution, etc., thus condemning themselves to a pitiful, rearguard, defensive action." George Lincoln Rockwell, White Power, Chapter 12. Quote, "Nazism replaces the collapsing conservative defense with vigorous attack, and when a people are as near to historical death as the whole white race, attack is not only the best defense, it is the only defense." George Lincoln Rockwell, White Power, Chapter 5. Quote, "The whole basis of the right wing was to try and hold or defend a shrinking perimeter, shouting, 'Never! Anti-this and anti-that.' One can only be shoved over the brink so many times, or trampled and annihilated up to a certain point when one must admit that, if it was a defensive struggle that was being waged, it was lost a little while ago." James Mason Siege 2.1. Quote, "The job is to build a world of our own, not to pull someone else's chestnuts out of the fire. Not a defense, but an attack. To borrow a Revolutionary Press statement by Ed Reynolds, quote, 'We don't want to rock the boat, we want to sink it.'" James Mason Siege 7.1. Quote, "Fascism is not Tory reaction in a black shirt or brown shirt, but the but the steel piston of realist revolution. William Brooke Joyce. Everywhere else where there exists the natural, organic, national, and racial identity, nationalists, let alone fascists and national socialists, realize that the state is a separate thing that exists as an expression of the nation, as part of its cultural expression, one that is organized towards manifesting the collective will of the nation in action for both internal and external matters. Quote, "The state is the form of a nation for action." Francis Parker Yockey, Imperium. However, through decay, the state may cease to be an expression of the nation. It may grow rigid and mechanical, very much in accordance with Oswald Spengler's concepts of culture and civilization. When this happens, nationalists have no qualms with laying to ruin the decadent and mechanical state along with all of the symbols which once expressed the pride and glory of the national culture. For when the state grows decadent and mechanic, all symbols and institutions become worth no more or less than the physical materials through which they were expressed. Institutions become just buildings, banners just colored rags. They may retain their cultural value in the memory of the nation, memory of the times when those institutions and symbols still retain their national essence, but they cannot become a value in and of themselves, worthy of defense at the expense of the nation's essence. In short, organic identity has nothing to fear in the loss of what it had produced itself in the first place. The nation takes primacy over the state, and thus the nation can always build a new state, but the state can never revitalize national health and restore the nation's spirit if the state itself had already ceased to be an expressive force of that nation. If the spirit and will of that identity, the essence of the nation and its character, still retains its vigor and vitality, then it will express itself anew. Nationalists can destroy the state in the name of their nation, so that a new, once again, truly national state may be built on the ruins, and a new flag unfurled to signify its rebirth. New in form and appearance, yet in reality but a new manifestation of that nation's distinct character, the expression of the eternal truth in its blood. Quote, "Our flag is neither red nor black, red, gold, nor black, white, red. It is the flag of a new, vast Reich that resides in our hearts, attaining in them its Gestalt. The day will come when we will be able to unfurl it." Ernst Jünger, forward to F.G. Jünger's book, March of Nationalism. Quote, "As sacred and dear as the old and beautiful colors must be, especially when they were fresh and youthful, to every decent German who has fought for them and has seen the sacrifices of so many under those colors, that flag is not the symbol for a battle of the future. In contrast to the privileged class politicians, I have always maintained the view in our movement that it is a real blessing for the German nation to have lost the old flag. What the new republic does under its flag is unimportant to us. But we should thank fate from the bottom of our hearts that it was merciful enough to protect the most glorious battle flag of all times from being used as a cover for the most shameful prostitution. The present Reich, which sells out itself and its citizens, must ever fly the heroic black, white, red flag of honor. As long as the November disgrace lasts, let it wear its own outer garment and not steal one from a more honest past. The conscience of our privileged class politicians should tell them that anyone who desires the black, white, red flag for the current state is stealing from our past. The old flag really was beautiful, but only for the old empire, just as the republic has chosen a new one that is suited to itself. This was the reason why we National Socialists could never consider raising the old flag as a symbolic expression of what we were working for. After all, we did not want to awaken the old dead empire, which was destroyed by its own faults. We wanted to build a new state. Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf, Volume 2, Chapter 7. However, USA is not an organic nation, as we've already stated. It was founded not as an expression of an organic nation's character and will, but instead in an idealistic experiment of rationalist thought, rooted in Enlightenment values. Here the state takes primacy over the vast array of people of different national and racial backgrounds, and imposes on them the values on which it was based, artificial values created from the imagination of men. The American state is a product of intellect, not of blood. There is no space for any organic nationalism here, only for the liberal civic nationalism of the nation state, which its paper identity of citizenship permitting anyone to become an American. As a result, the American identity is one that has been artificially grown in accordance to state interests, one that disregards the organic national and racial backgrounds of the people who came to settle and populate the United States, one that has been planned and directed in its growth by those in power, and if you take to heart what Francis Parker Yockey said in Imperium, then this identity has also been the plaything of the Jews since the 1930s. Thus, Americans are by far and large no more than civic nationalists and patriots, and whoever tries to walk outside that mold is immediately chastised for being un-American. To be an American is to wave the state flag and to praise the piece of paper on which this artificial construct was founded, the Constitution, as well as the men who had concocted it, the Founding Fathers. The latter two elements hold no more intrinsic value than the Communist Manifesto and the Founding Fathers of Communism, Marx and Engels. USA might as well have been set up on those grounds, and then it would have been un-American not praise the manifesto. There is no national character to fall back on because there is no one single nationality that can lay claim to the United States for its conception. Moreover, there is nothing to fall back on, period, because Americanism has for the most part effectively wiped out any and all national and racial identity and conscious heritage of its European settlers. Quote, "What sort of movement would it take to represent the will of the American people today? With some variation, several are already on the scene, and I might add, none of them remotely resemble anything National Socialist. Then, too, there is no American people, only whites who, for the most part, have lost all racial pride and identity. But they are only reflections of what their rulers, the upper classes, have made themselves into. In a plutocracy which this is, the wealthy decide and control the mold of the society, how the future generations will take shape. And, like any god, they can predictably be expected to fashion the people of the future in their own image. Meet the future today as it was envisioned 40 and 50 years ago. And tomorrow?" James Mason, Siege 3.9. As a result, Americans are heavily dependent on their state/paper identity, which goes a long way to ensure its survival, as the American right wing, by definition, stands in defense of that, on which the state relies for its power and control of the populace. Whatever alternatives get formed continue to rely on that same premise and thus invariably handcuff themselves to the system, as they effectively do not wish to fight and destroy it, but rather come to control and change it. Hipster conservatism does the same thing but makes it fun, leading the American youth to further comply with the fake paper identity of the state as they put on their MAGA hats. Though from everything that has been said so far, it should be clear why no fascist or National Socialist will ever agree that America had ever been great. An American fascist/National Socialist, if he is truly National Socialist, cannot agree either. To him, American futurism and siege are the only ways to liberate the people from the clutches of the system, in order to foster something truly organic in its place. With the destruction of the system in America, the ensuing conflict and strife will by necessity give rise to something organic and full of vitality, capable of establishing its own state as the expression of that new organic identity, full of life and creative force behind it. What that new entity will be cannot be predicted any more than one could predict what the Germans, French, and English would grow to become at the dawn of their inception, for that mystery of their blood, imparted on them by the absolute truth, God, etc., had not yet come to express itself. To conclude, fascists and National Socialists, including American ones, have no allies in the American right-wing scene, as they are hopelessly enslaved to an entity that is fundamentally contrary to everything we stand and fight for. Hence they are incapable of even mounting an effective attack against it, let alone of pursuing the same goals as us. This only compounds the criticism of the American right wing that has already been presented via the Rockwell quotes earlier. Alt-right, as hipster conservatism, simply falls into the same category as old and tired mainstream conservatism, just younger and hip with the times. The only path American fascists and National Socialists have before them is that of American futurism. Still, as we said at the start of this segment, we do not believe that this alone is the original alt-right. However, the hipster conservative alt-right has come into existence once the term alt-right had reached mainstream notoriety, of which we will speak more in the next segment, dealing with the real nature of the alt-right. And that'll end this recording.